Naturalization, or how to become a Filipino citizen. There are three ways through which a foreigner can become a Filipino citizen. One, an act of Congress can confer Philippine citizenship on a foreigner. This is a rare occurrence. Second, administrative naturalization is open to those who were born in the Philippines and who have resided here since birth. One does not have to go through court in administrative naturalization. Instead, the petition is filed with a special committee at the Office of the Solicitor General. The third way is the most common. That is through court. This is judicial naturalization. Judicial naturalization. For this, you have to meet the qualifications for Philippine citizenship. These are fixed by law. You have to be at least 21 years old. You must have resided in the Philippines for 10 years. You are of good moral character and believe in the Philippine Constitution. You must also have conducted yourself in an irreproachable manner with the government and the community in which you live. You must own real estate or have some lucrative trade or profession. You must be able to speak and write English, Spanish, or one of the main Philippine languages. Your minor children must have been enrolled in an accredited school, open to all races where Philippine history, government, and civics are taught during your entire period of residence. There can be exceptions to this requirement, but there need to be good reasons for that. The 10-year residence requirement can be reduced to 5 years if one of certain conditions are met. These are if you were born in the Philippines, if you are married to a Filipino, if you were a teacher here for at least 2 years at an inclusive school, if you established a new industry or invention in the Philippines, if you honorably held office in the government of the Philippines. Filing your declaration of intention to become a Filipino citizen. At least a year before the petition itself is filed in court, a declaration of intention to become a Filipino citizen has to be filed with the Office of the Solicitor General. You don't have to file this declaration and wait the year if 1. You've already lived in the Philippines for 30 years, or 2. You were born in the Philippines and were educated in a non-race restricted and SHED recognized school for your primary and secondary education. The petition for naturalization. The petition for naturalization should be prepared well. It's going to be the basis for the entire case, and it needs to be prepared so that it complies with all the requirements. The omissions of these requirements are going to be fatal to the case. An inadequate petition is going to be either dismissed or denied. These requirements include your detailed personal circumstances and those of your spouse and children, your port of first debarkation, and if remembered, the ship or flight on which you first arrived in the country, the declaration that you possess all the qualifications and none of the disqualifications for citizenship, the declaration that you filed your intention to become a Filipino, if required, declaration that you will live in the Philippines from the start of the petition until it is granted. You'll also need to include the names and post office addresses of any witnesses you want to be part of the case. And of course, the petition has to be sworn to and signed by you. You'll also need to attach documents which include affidavits of 2 Filipino citizens who have personally known you for 10 years, or 5, depending on whether you qualify. They will attest to your good moral character and affirm that you are qualified for citizenship. The certificate of arrival, the declaration of intention, also need to be attached. Filing the petition and the court process. A petition for naturalization should be filed with the regional trial court of the city where you have lived for at least the last year. There are publication requirements which need to be complied with, both in a newspaper as well as with the official Gazette of the Republic. These serve as public notice of the application for citizenship. The case cannot be heard by the court until after 90 days from the date of last publication. Notice of the court hearing should also be posted in several public places set by the law. The notice should state your personal circumstances, the date and place of your first arrival in the Philippines, the names of your witnesses, and the assigned hearing date. At the first hearing date, the court shall check compliance with these notice requirements. After that, the presentation of evidence can commence. This is a court trial where you have to prove you fulfill the conditions of citizenship, that you have all the qualifications and none of the disqualifications for naturalization. This is done by presenting evidence to prove these facts to the court through documents and witnesses who know you and can credibly confirm your fitness. Preparing for all of these has to be done thoroughly and carefully so that the judge rules in your favor and the Philippine government does not oppose the court's grant of citizenship.
Thank you for watching. For more videos, you can watch us on this channel. For more content and online consultations, you can find us on lawyerphilippines.org.